Hello and welcome to this episode of Employsure Essentials. Today I'm going to have a chat with Harry Hillier, one of our expert advisors on all things overtime. As Harry says, there's a lot of confusion out there, particularly around how salaries interact with overtime payments and how some employers manage it depending on their industry and depending on their award. There's a lot to consider, so let's get into it. Hi Harry, thanks for coming today.
Pleasure to be here, Scott.
So today we're going to have a bit of a chat about overtime. Let's start with the basics. Is there a definition of it? I mean, is it clear?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's a definition in the National Employment Standards for maximum weekly hours of work for a full-time employee, and that's set at 38. So any hours that an employee works in excess of 38 will generally be considered overtime. Now, obviously, that's where it gets a lot more complex in terms of how that time is treated and how we pay for it.
Okay, great. Before we get to how it's treated and how to manage it, how does an employer know if their staff are entitled to overtime? Is it in the employment standards or is it an award?
The National Employment Standards don't provide a lot of guidance. It's really going to come out of a modern award. So, as is always the case, it's crucial for an employer to be aware whether or not a modern award applies to your employees and how that modern award will impact your obligations in relation to overtime.
Okay. And is that everyone? I mean, is that every industry, every employer, or does it come down to every workplace is different?
Every workplace is indeed different. There are a number of industries and occupations that are going to be covered by a modern award and the modern award system. And there's a number of employees and industries out there which are what we call award free, which means they're not covered by a modern award and obligations are much more streamlined, much more simple.
Okay. But still, it comes down to that individual space too, I suppose.
Yeah. So, it's never going to be, one rule even at a single business. You can have multiple awards at a business. Some employees can be covered, some employees cannot be. It's a very, very tricky area.
Okay. And just to really, hopefully not to confuse things anymore there, but what about when we talk about it in terms of penalty rates? I mean, if I run a bar on a Sunday afternoon and I've got staff that have done 12 hours, if that's overtime, does it stack, if I can use that word, to penalty rates on top? I mean,
it is a common question we get from our clients. If my employees are working overtime on a Sunday, do they get quadruple time? Fortunately, it's the case that we consider overtime different to ordinary time. Ordinary time is within that 38 hours, as I said earlier, and generally can incur penalty rates if worked at certain times of the day or week. And overtime is outside of that time. So the penalties that would have applied on ordinary time will not apply on overtime. So fortunately, it's one or the other.
No one's getting quadruple time then. Great.
Not yet.
Not yet. That's a good point. That's a good point. Okay, so do employers need to notify staff then? I mean, if I wanted to sit here and, because I'm such a studious worker, if I wanted to sit here till 11:30 tonight and bill the employer for 6 hours overtime, I mean, is that fair? Does that sound good? Or
Yeah, look, again, a pretty common question that we get through. Look, it's simply the case that overtime will most commonly need to be at the employer's direction. Just sitting there in the office or in the workshop until all hours of the morning and expected to be paid for it, simply isn't going to be the case. Overtime, if it's going to be worked, will most commonly need to be at the direction of the employer. However, in some cases, it can be that the employee can show they have been given so much work and the expectation is so high that it was reasonable to expect they'd need to work some extra hours. So it can get a little bit tricky, but the general rule is it must be at the direction of the employer.
Yeah, okay, and even if it's a little bit tricky there's got to be a reason, doesn't there? There's got to be a pretty valid reason for someone to be doing a fair bit of overtime.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They've got to be able to show that, there was really no other option given the expectations that were placed on them about, completing the work they've had.
Yeah, okay, great. And what about if we look at recording overtime payments? I mean, do you need to keep records? Does it need to be separately recorded or what's the technical rules around that one?
Yeah, so look, the Fair Work regulations tell employers what sort of records they need to keep regarding employees and absolutely working overtime, hours of overtime that are worked is right up there in terms of an employee record that an employer needs to record and hold on to. So, in that regard, where you have employees working overtime, it's quite critical that you're making a note of that and keeping a record of that, preferably in a pay slip, preferably also in a timesheet to ensure that you're complying with that requirement.
Yeah, okay. And I mean, the penalties have just gone up for failing to keep those records, and more than that, the compliance is certainly there. So people need to be getting that right, don't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, Harry, our favourite game of mine is hypotheticals, so let's give it a crack. I run a construction company, and all of my employees are on a salary. Job runs a bit over. Do I have to pay everyone overtime?
Look, a common question we get from our clients is, where an employee is on a salary, do they get overtime? Do they get additional payments? What's important in this regard is that we remember that the modern award system, if a modern award applies to the employee, is treated as a safety net. So in the construction industry, we'll have the Building and Construction Award, which will set out a number of obligations about allowances and penalty rates and overtime. Now, what we need to make sure is that over the life of the employment relationship, our employees are receiving at least what they would have received had they been paid on the base award wage with all penalties, all allowances, all loadings, all overtime, all other entitlements factored in. So it's all well and good to pay a salary, but if that salary isn't sufficiently compensating an employee for the entitlements that they should be receiving under the award, it's not going to be sufficient and you will be underpaying them. So what a lot of employers will do is factor in a certain amount of overtime hours into a salary, so they can build an expectation with employees of needing to work extra time. But if you're just playing a bit of guesswork, you're opening yourself up to a bit of risk there.
Yeah, so get that advice, I suppose, is the best piece, to just make sure you're really across your workplace, your situation. And as you said before, you could have a couple of different awards covering any workplace, so just making sure that you're getting it right.
Absolutely. It's a very complex one and takes up a lot of our time. So, definitely want to get advice on.
Okay, Harry, we've covered a lot today. Let's rattle off a top tip. What do every employer need to be doing? What should they be doing to make sure they're getting this overtime process right?
Look, I was talking earlier about salaries, and as I said, it's a very common practice for employers to, avoid overtime payments through above award wages or salary packaging, whatever it may be. My top tip is, if you're going to enter into one of those arrangements, it's absolutely critical that you're recorded in writing. You explain in a written agreement, what the employee is being compensated for and how that arrangement works. The simple fact is that having a verbal agreement is never going to be good enough. And if you are using a salary packaging arrangement or whatever it may be, there must be a written agreement offsetting certain entitlements under the award. And in the absence of it, a savvy lawyer or a union representative can cause all sorts of problems. So absolutely critical that you could keep those arrangements in writing.
Okay, so know your obligations and get it in writing. Good
Absolutely.
advice. Harry, thanks for your time.
Not a problem, Scott.
Well, there's the essentials. Harry covered a lot there, but ultimately, employers need to be aware that not only is every workplace different, but overtime can also vary between employees based on awards and individual contracts. So employers need to be sure that they've set clear guidelines and employees know what to expect. As always, if you need advice on this or any other topic, phone EmploySure on 1300 651 415. I'm Scott McGrath, looking forward to your company next episode.